Our next speaker, John Shapiro, is going to pick up where Marie just left off and look at how the work that you've already been doing here in the States, for example, as Marie mentioned, preparing for FSMA, will stand you in good stead for now looking at Europe. John is a member of Freeborn and Peter's food industry team, advising a wide range of US companies and specifically food and beverage. John specializes in areas such as food safety, compliance, supply chain management, and the dreaded litigation. In addition to his day job, John serves as General Counsel to the Inspiration Corporation, which, as I've learned, is one of the many brilliant food industry supported charities that are based here in Chicago. So John, please.
Good evening, and thank you. Thank you for Enterprise Ireland for hosting this event, my colleagues at Freeborn and Peters for providing this opportunity for us to have a little bit of dialogue on these very important issues: food safety, expanding food businesses, and expanding into Europe. So, Marie and I are going to touch on a number of themes. She from the European perspective, my presentation from a more US-centric presentation. If you're preparing for the changes in the food laws here in the US, you're a good ways already over the ocean heading toward Europe. That's one of the themes of my presentation. Now, preventing food safety issues from arising is a little bit like the old-fashioned Rubik's Cube. I may be dating myself, but as many of you know, and you can see here, it's a three-dimensional puzzle. It's complicated, and it takes planning and dedication and study, and sometimes trial and error to get it right. Preparation is a key issue, whether you're doing business here in the US or you're doing business in Europe or worldwide. So why is ongoing study and preparation for FSMA critical? Well, if you're a US company and you don't take heed of it and follow its directives, it's going to cause you some headaches and some problems. And of course, as we're learning tonight, FSMA compliance paves the way for expansion to the EU. Although there are differences between the systems, they're really quite similar in most regards. So, FSMA and the EU General Food Law, they seek the same results, right? They want to provide consumers with safe food, and they want to provide accurate labeling information that so consumers can make informed choices. And critically, they want to provide guidelines to companies so that they know how to operate and they know how to address the risks inherent in manufacturing safe food. So it's a little bit like the Wizard of Oz and the yellow brick road that Dorothy and her friends had to follow. It's a little bit of a journey. At the end, there's the Emerald City, but there are going to be a few bumps and bruises and hurdles to overcome in between. So in thinking about food safety, it's obviously critical to think about what are the regulatory obligations of a company, but it's also important to think about what are the drivers of those obligations. And of course, there's the desire for food safety, but there's much more than that. There's the globalization of the supply chain, and whether you're doing business in the EU between different European countries or you're getting products and supplies from across the world, the globalization of the supply chain is making food company businesses more complicated. And of course, there's scientific advancement. It's easier to figure out what are the microbes and the various other issues that impact food and cause good food to go sour. And of course, there's technology. It's really technology that is making all of this possible right now. Not only expansion, but making the food laws evolve and become more controlling and generating more opportunities and more safe food. Technology makes it possible to have better internal controls, to obtain more knowledge about those with whom you do business, and, as we heard Marie said, trace your food supply chain. So, and of course, we can't forget the consumers, right? That's in part really who's driving this. Consumers demand compliance with safety regulations. And it's easy in this day and age of electronic media, right? Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. I know there are a host of other ones, and probably ones that are coming out as we speak right now, where a consumer idea, right or wrong, can cause a firestorm for a company. And of course, as we've seen, consumers don't always get it right. Many of you may know of the pink slime example here in the States. Just a couple of years ago, safe product, leanly fine textured ground beef, good product. It added to ground beef products. It dealt with a lot of waste issues, and the FDA and the USDA deemed it perfectly safe. But consumers got a hold of it, dubbed it pink slime, didn't like the idea of this beef product being added to their other beef products, and lo and behold, because of social media and because of consumer demand, that company that manufactured that product, that was a family business and employed a number of people, couldn't survive, went under, went bankrupt, and no longer exists. So, food safety and the related supply chain problems occur daily. And that's what Marie was talking about, and that's what I'm talking about. How do you address these risks, whether you're doing business here in the US, whether you're doing business in the EU, or you're somewhere in between trying to expand one way or the other. So in my few minutes tonight, here's what I hope to accomplish, which is an overview of the preventative control rules under FSMA. FSMA, as many of you know, is massive, and there simply isn't enough time this evening to go through all of those rules in detail. So I'm choosing to focus in on the preventative control rules and then talk a little bit about the import rules. And then my presentation is, how do you reduce risks of doing business here and thinking about expanding your business and then expanding your business to the EU? And I suggest there are really two critical assessments. One is taking a look at yourself, the internal assessment, that the other one is taking a look at your supply partners, an external assessment. So just in case you want to tune out now, wait for the next panel, I like to give my takeaways up front, right? Your company, wherever it does business, bears the burden for food safety. And the EU and the US laws are fundamentally about managing your risks. And you can reduce risks and mitigate damages should they happen by taking a look at your internal operations, figuring out what you have to comply with and making sure you comply, and making sure that your suppliers are doing the same. And in doing all of this, should there be any angst about expanding to the US, you should take comfort if you're a US company, because FSMA is going to get you most of the way there. So FSMA in operation, there are 5 separate components that all intertwine. There's prevention, which we're going to talk about briefly. There's inspection and compliance, there's regulatory response, there's import safety, and there are enhanced partnerships. Some of those partnerships being between the US government and the various governments that comprise the EU. Prevention is the bedrock of what's going on here in the States, and it already is the bedrock of what's going on and has gone on for a little bit in the EU. It used to be that when there was a foodborne illness, the FDA or other agency would react to that foodborne illness and then take steps to mitigate it and reduce the harm. Now, the US food laws are all about preventing contamination before it happens. So there are 2 critical preventive control rules for FSMA. The first deals with the manufacture of food. So in that plan, or rule requires companies to do a deep dive into their operations and come up with a written food safety plan that covers really the totality of their operations, but particularly addresses hazards. You have to go in and identify hazards that may arise within your food operations. You have to determine what the preventative controls are before you operate. And then you have to set up monitoring programs to make sure that your plan is being carried out, verification programs to make sure that the monitoring and the preventative controls and the hazard analysis is operating properly. Corrective actions should something go wrong, and record keeping on each component of your food safety plan. Now, frankly, each of these areas within the preventative control rule would be worthy of a separate conference presentation. But the point is, as Marie said, preparation is the key. Thinking about these issues, preparing for them, and implementing them. Now, Marie mentioned HACCP, Hazard Analysis of Critical Control Points. Europe has been out front in this issue for a while. In the US, we require HACCP plans only for juice and seafood. So this preventative control rule really is a new concept for most companies doing business here in the US. But as you can see in Europe, the regulations to which you'd be subject if you are operating in Europe, they're very similar. You have to identify hazards, you have to analyze them, establish protocols to address them, keep records, and verify the procedures. Now, there is a difference between what's going on here in the US and the European HACCP, and that is, in the US, actually, it's going to be more expansive. In other words, the hazard analysis goes beyond just identifying critical control points and determining what you have to do to address those critical control points. So, if you have a properly operating preventative control plan here in the US, you should be good to go, by and large, if you move that operation to Europe. Now, the other aspect of the preventative control rule is for produce operations, farmers. There you don't need a written supply plan, but what you do have to do is provide scientific-based protocols to make sure that you're identifying pathways of contamination. They have to be reasonable, and they have to work. Now, most companies don't fall within this rule, but it's still critical to understand its operation, because certainly most companies have supply partners who, at some point within the supply chain, will be subject to this rule. It is critical to know what your supply partners are doing and what obligations they're beholden to. So let me move on for a moment to import safety. Import safety is a huge issue for both the US and the EU with the globalization of the supply chain. In the US, approximately 15% of our food supply is imported, and that is growing at an astronomical rate each year. The clear import of FSMA is that your company is responsible for the food it imports. But in order to mitigate the risks of what that means, you have to know what your supply partners, whether it be domestic or, clearly for the import rule, international, are doing. FSMA has created a number of programs designed to address this, some of which the EU is pushing back on. One of them is the Foreign Supplier Verification Program, which, unlike the EU, would require companies that are doing business with the US, importing their food into the US, verify that they are applying and adhering to US standards. So it's very controversial, and it's unclear exactly how that's going to be enforced or the extent to which it's going to be enforced. For those of you here in the US who have some concern about it, or perhaps in the EU who are concerned about it as well, if you're a supplier, the comment period under the Foreign Supplier Verification Rule and the other rules that form the bedrock of FSMA are still open. The FSMA rules won't be fully finalized until June 30th, 2015, if then. There's a movement up front or afoot to have the U.S. Congress expand those time periods so that we make sure that the FDA gets it right. So, in my remaining time, I want to just talk about what should you be doing now. So, what should you be doing now to mitigate risk? What you should be doing now internally and externally. So, if you're doing business here and you want to do business in the EU, you certainly should be preparing regardless of the regulatory implementation time frame, again, internally and externally. Both of those will help you reduce risk, because regardless of the regulations, it's important to realize this is the best practice right now. And whether you're doing business in the EU, you're doing business here in the States, or you're doing business somewhere else, even if these regulations don't catch up with the grandiose government plan, litigants will. And certainly here in the US, where consumers can directly sue under a variety of theories, but in the EU under a tort theory, it's going to be the same. The EU General Food Law and FSMA represent the best practices that we know of right now and things that companies should be implementing in order to make their food supply safe. So, internal preparation, planning is key. A culture of food safety is critical. A food safety team from the top down, buy-in from the top management to the people who are actually implementing it is critical. Under FSMA, companies in each facility must identify and train a food safety team leader so that that person knows what requirements that facility must meet on a daily basis. But it must go beyond that. It has to employee training, right? Everybody needs to know about the culture of food safety and the risks of what's happening and be accountable for problems within the food operations. And of course, then we saw under the preventative control rule itself, the comprehensive hazard analysis and then the preparation of a written plan that addresses how you're going to operate in a safe fashion and what you're going to do to correct it should there be a problem. So I like to give takeaways. And so here, as best I could fit onto one page, is what I believe to be a fairly comprehensive internal operations checklist, but I call it an overview. It's certainly not everything that a company needs to do, but it's most of the way, and it's thought-provoking and idea-generating to take a company and make sure that its internal operations comply with FSMA requirements. So I want to spend the remainder of my minutes talking about supply relationships, right? As this cartoon shows, even simple supply relationships can be difficult. And I spend a good chunk of my time either managing on supply relationships and supply disputes or litigating them. And they can be difficult and they can become bet-the-house cases. So, and FSMA and the EU General Food Law and the requirements that they bring may complicate relationships. So it's critical under FSMA, as it is under the EU General Food Law, to know with whom you are dealing and how they are doing it. So, business practices to implement and avoid disputes and mitigate risks is to think about your supply relationships just like you're thinking about your internal operations. Anticipate where there might be weak links in that supply relationship and address those possible supply disputes. Prepare a plan before a dispute becomes overly complicated or before it gets to litigation. A simple concept, but few companies do it. Carefully contract to set supply terms and mitigate risk. Get the contract terms that meet your business needs. And critically, provide in your supply agreements for supply chain transparency. Transparency goes hand in hand with risk management. There are a number of broad but essential considerations that go into supply agreements, whether you're, again, doing business here in the U.S. domestically or you're doing business in the EU, whether you're importing into the EU, you set up business there, or you're getting ingredients from elsewhere. The parties, simple concept, but often companies stumble over that one. They're never quite sure with whom they're dealing with. As Marie said, what are the business and cultural needs of your supply partners? What are your supply parameters? Who's providing what, under what time frames, and under what qualifications? Visibility and transparency, we've mentioned. It's critical for preventing risks and implementing your preventative controls. And jurisdictional issues, whether you choose to operate in the EU or whether you choose to operate in the US or some combination in between, it is critical to determine with your supply partners, and whether you form a joint venture or something else, what is going to be the law that governs your disputes. That may determine the outcome of how a dispute is resolved and whether it's resolved in your favor. Now, those considerations aren't always easy because, as we can see here from an FDA diagram, the supply chains for food in particular are becoming more complicated. And here you can see it's a can of tuna that ends up somewhere in, looks like Omaha, Nebraska. It starts somewhere on the other side of Australia, stops in Europe, and goes on a variety of other places. So these relationships are complicated, just as complicated as the EU General Food Law obligations and the FSMA food law obligations. But with preparation, they can be broken down and your supply relationships can be made more safe. So again, another checklist for you to take away. And it's really, again, about thorough and thoughtful evaluation of your supply relationships and building into your supply relationships the terms that you need, including and critically disruptions that may occur under the EU food law or under FSMA. In the States, the FDA now has new authority to disrupt your supply chain, whether it's through detaining foods or requiring a mandatory recall. Who gets left holding the damages from that may depend on how you define your supply relationships and how you word what might otherwise be considered very mundane boilerplate clauses. So, in essence, the US and the EU food laws are about the same thing. They're about making sure that from farm to table, companies are providing safe food and that they're taking the steps necessary to reduce their risks in preparing that food. So, summary solutions, there are a number of them, but I've tried to boil it down really to two here. Being proactive and assessing internal operations, figuring out what regulations you need to comply with where, and figuring out how you're going to make your operations meet that. And then assessing your supply partners and making sure that they're doing the same thing. Each of these may be a game changer for your companies regardless of where they choose to operate. And thank you for the opportunity to discuss this issue. I too will be around, so if you have any questions, I'd be pleased to address them afterwards. Thank you.